Okay, so wonderful. We're so happy to have you here, Joanna. Dr. Joanna Lambert is a scientist and tenured professor of wildlife ecology and conservation biology at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she also serves as director of the American Canid Project and the Wild Animals and Humans Laboratory. Born and raised in industrial England and an immigrant to the Rust Belt of the United States, Joanna spent her formative years observing animals in heavily urbanized landscapes. She has spent her adult life making up for this by traveling to some of the planet's most remote regions to study the behavior and ecology of wild animals in wild places. Her work has now taken her to all 7 continents, but a major focus of her research has been on equatorial Africa, where she studies primates such as chimpanzees, and the American West, where she studies carnivores. She has published several books and hundreds of peer-reviewed articles on her research and serves as editor for several international science journals. For her efforts, she has been elected as a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, as well as an elected fellow of the Linnean Society of London, the institution where Charles Darwin first presented his theory of evolution. In addition to being a field scientist and educator, Joanna is also a conservation practitioner and activist. In this capacity, she serves as a member of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Species Survival Commission, and as an advisor to the United Nations Environmental Program, and sits on the board of directors for the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. And in her spare time, as if she had any, Joanna spends as much time as she can off-grid in the wild, in wild and rugged places, preferably on a horse and with her dogs, striving for optimism and solutions in a challenging world. So thank you so much, Joanna. I'm going to turn it over to you.
And thank you so much, Steph. Can you hear me? Am I good?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. And so I guess what I do now is just share my screen, right? Just I guess kind of old, like regular Zoom. Let me just let me just see if this works.
If you have any videos, make sure you click to optimize video.
Oh yeah, I don't have any videos. How does this look? Do you guys have the regular view?
Yep, looks great.
Yep. Okay, you don't have the presenter view.
Correct.
Good, right. That's great. Hi, everybody. Hi from Yellowstone, where I'm sitting in my little research cabin on the Yellowstone River, enjoying life. My Wi-Fi isn't great, so bear with me if I kind of bog down. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Steph, and thank you so much to the Speak for Wolves group for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here. As the introduction, I'm going to start my timer because I have a tendency to run long. As the introduction indicated, I'm an evolutionary ecologist writ large, which means that I'm interested in sort of where things come from and the history of things. I like to explain things in light of what has come before. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing today in this talk on lessons from evolutionary history for coexisting with predators today. I'm going to start with this image, which has absolutely nothing to do with wolves or animals, just to indicate that these are the kinds of habitats that I grew up in, right? So born and raised in England in the 60s and 70s, emigrated to Chicago, Illinois. I lived in urbanized landscapes. I knew how to get around in cities, right? But I didn't know a whole heck of a lot about other things. But despite this, right, and perhaps a function of sort of tenacity, a combination of tenacity, will, good luck, etc., I've ended up having the extraordinary good fortune of being able to study in the wild some of the most remarkable species anywhere in very remote places around the world. The reason why I bring this up, the reason why I juxtapose this slide with the previous slide is because what has ended up happening is that over the last 30 plus years or so, with my emphasis particularly on equatorial Africa and now more recently in the greater Yellowstone ecosystems, what this means is that I am now working in landscapes that are radically different than the landscapes that I know about, right? So what this means in terms of, where I'm going with this talk, observations relative to this talk is that this disjuncture, this dissonance between my knowledge base and then where I ended up doing my work, right, gave me an incredible meta-awareness of my own naivete and my own lack of knowledge in new landscapes, lack of knowledge about how to be in landscapes with large-bodied apex predators. It also, over the years, since I've been sort of in the trenches doing a lot of conservation biology, especially more recently human-wildlife conflict issues, it's also given me an awareness of the increasing numbers of human-wildlife interactions in which humans exhibit, in some cases, extreme naivete about how to be around those animals. And these images are quite familiar to anyone that spent any time in Yellowstone National Park, for sure. The other piece of this is that my most recent work with carnivore biology, and especially as I'll talk about with the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, my recent research and conservation action has really highlighted to me the level of fear that is occurring, right? And also how fear can lead to antipathy towards predators. And so this is where I want to go today, because it has direct consequences for the ways for the ways in which people are thinking about wolves, thinking about getting wolves back to areas where they haven't been for a long time. So essentially what I want to do is hook up these ideas of a lack of knowledge, this idea of naivete, and this idea of fear and antipathy. Right. So more specifically with the goals of this talk, I want to focus on human predator interactions in the American West and what this means for conservation action, describe how humans have historically, and I mean deep time, shared landscapes with predators, and then ultimately conclude that understanding whence we came and how we have been, our evolutionary past, and also the neurobiology of fear can provide tenets for coexistence that rest on a deep understanding of knowledge and habituation. I would be remiss in any talk that I ever give if I did not mention something. Climate thankfully gets the attention that it deserves. I feel like the biodiversity extinction crisis that we are experiencing is not as much a part of the vernacular and socio-political awareness as I would like it to be. And so any talk that I give, I'm going to be highlighting the fact that all of what we are doing is occurring within the context, within the framework of the sixth extinction, right? The biodiversity crisis. We've lost untold numbers of species, and over 1 million species are on the brink of extinction. Now, the good news is, and specifically for this talk, is that through adaptation on the part of predators themselves and other species, in addition to conservation action like reintroductions, rewilding, the Endangered Species Act, we now have species that are thriving, that are flourishing, that are entering into landscapes where they haven't been for a long time, right? So, and this is indeed what I've been working on for a number of years now, especially looking at ways in which one canid, in this case, coyotes, are adapting to heavily urbanized areas, and then also being heavily involved in the initiative that, of course, we are all fully aware of that is occurring in Colorado. And it's this latter piece that I really want to emphasize in this talk. And that is, and of course, it goes almost without saying, because I think we're all aware of this, but gray wolves on the Colorado ballot. I've been part of this initiative for many years now, when it was Initiative 107, then Proposition 114, right? It is now Colorado law as of the 2020 general election. And it was because of this work, especially, sort of trying to right some of the wrongs that humans have bestowed on our landscapes, trying to put something back whence it came, that I became very aware of the particular vitriol surrounding wolves, right? This came up in so many contexts, right? Something that we all in this virtual forum that we're in now fully aware of, right? Op-eds, news magazine, or news forums, magazines, talks, all kinds of ways that people were indicating their displeasure with the initiative, and then also, underpinning all of this, an overarching sense of fear. And this isn't just a sense, this was explicit in many of the headlines that were appearing over the past few years in Colorado, which led me as a conservation biologist and also an evolutionary ecologist to start thinking about, where does this come from? Right? And where does this fear and antipathy derive? And how is it impacting our interactions with recovering species? And I would argue that this is more than just an academic exercise. This is more than just a socio-political challenge. These kinds of emotional states, right, of fear, of antipathy, are influencing our ability to implement conservation actions and right our wrongs, right? So I'm going to give you the argument before I even launch into some of the details, right? And the knowns, the argument where I'm going with this is that our brain, as a vertebrate, as a mammal, is wired to fear predators. Right. There's that intensely important survivorship value to this. And life with predators in our evolutionary past required specialized knowledge beyond that required for life with wild animals in general. The issue is that over the past 11,000 years in Western and to a lesser degree, Central Europe, into the 19th and 20th century of the United States, predators, as we all know, were all but completely extirpated. And with the loss of the predators came a loss of the habituation to life with predators, along with the specialized knowledge required to live with those predators, coexist with those predators, leading to an overarching sense of fear, which then leads to reduced tolerance. And where this is sort of where these worlds are colliding is the fact that now, because of adaptation on the part of our many wildlife species and conservation actions, predator populations like coyotes, like gray wolves, like grizzly bears are now increasing, and ranges are now expanding, which, not for all of us, but for many folks, has resulted in kind of a fear state, right? And an antipathy, a resistance to having those animals around, something that folks might call conflict. The reality is, as an evolutionary biologist, I've done quite a bit of paleontology in the past. The fact is that humans evolved alongside and coexisted with predators throughout virtually all, not quite all, but almost all of our time on planet Earth, right? And these weren't, so here's just a brief map. Sorry, I nearly forgot to mention. I want to just spend a little time in the Pleistocene epoch, which is the epoch of geological time that our own species evolved in, roughly 250 to 300,000 years ago, as paleontologists understand it. Our species then moved into Europe according to the fossil record, at about 30 to 70,000 years ago. And then, of course, ultimately populated the world. And it is during this Pleistocene era, right, that Pleistocene predators, compared to modern predators, there were very many more of them. They were vastly more abundant, greater biomass, on average per species assemblage or per community, about, pardon me, 47% larger, and more large species, large-bodied species, meaning over 100 kilograms per community, maybe 5 to 6. This is the work, beautiful work of Blair Van Valkenburg at UCLA, an incredibly important paleontologist, and her assessments of what the carnivore guilds were up until about 12,000 years ago. Here's just some data to support some of this. What you're looking at the top in blue, recent assemblages of carnivore, in the United States, in Asia, and in Africa, the total number versus in the latter portion of the Pleistocene in the Old World and the New World, very many more in the Pleistocene. What you're looking at here is an indicator of total body mass. The blue are the extant or the living assemblages of predators versus Pleistocene that you're seeing in the red and below that were around up until about 11 to 12 to 13,000 years ago. And you can see on average these differences in body mass. They were bigger, there were more of them, and they were sort of omnipresent. And indeed, overarchingly, what this means is that coexisting humans living in landscapes with large-bodied predators meant that our ancestors dealt with the potential threat of predation on an almost 24-hour basis. And the prospect of fear would have been a reality at all times, right? Day and night. And this is represented in our neurobiology, right? Oh, the wind is blowing the curtains here. In our neurobiology, right? We've got this wired into our brain. In our limbic system, we've got an incredible neuroscience to document every aspect of our fear response. And what we know about this fear response in the limbic system is that it is ancient, a very, very ancient neurobiological phenomenon that we share with all vertebrates, right? It's been around for at least 400 million years. And I won't get into the neuroscience or neuroendocrinology of it, but basically, there are signals that are sent via the hypothalamus and the pituitary to the adrenal glands to prepare for fight or flight. And the kind of learning that takes place when one is in fight or flight, that kind of learning that is pulling in the hippocampus of the brain, is extremely impactful. These are the kinds of memories that stick with an individual throughout their lifetime. When there's fear associated with learning, those are deeply, deeply seated learned processes. I've got these images here of this elk being, potentially preyed on by these wolves, and then this child being read Little Red Riding Hood, to emphasize the fact that the same aspects of the biology of fear that's going on in that elk, and we do know that non-human species get PTSD, and that predation in non-human species is the greatest source of that PTSD. We know that it is the same set of neuroendocrinological kinds of processes that are going on in this child as he or she is learning in a fairy tale about how scary wolves are, as similar to what is going on with this male elk, right? So the question is, how did our ancestors coexist and cope? And, I could go through a lot of the details of this, but in the interest of time, I'll just say the biggest picture part of that is just being accustomed, habituated to the presence of that stimulus, being accustomed to the potential for predation. But this goes hand in hand with knowledge that is transmitted culturally, knowledge that is transmitted socially through direct observational learning, as well as a diverse and rich toolkit, and including dogs, right? And these are aspects, this idea of being habituated to predators, having this knowledge, having the toolkit, including dogs, are the aspects of our life with predators that we have lost, especially throughout the Holocene, in parts of throughout Western Europe, and more recently in the United States, right, over the past 200 years ago. And the issue is that if you're in a constant state of fear, this is expensive metabolically and also hijacks the brain for its ability to learn and reason. And this further suggests that being habituated, because you can't be in that state of fight or flight, is evolutionarily advantageous, which means that to live in a landscape of what have been called landscapes of fear, where there are predators and there are prey, is this balance between being sensitized to knowing that they're around and being smart about it, but also being habituated to it. And in other words, of knowing when to be afraid and knowing when not to be afraid. And this is true for all prey species and is highly conserved. And so these landscapes of fear in the Pleistocene means that humans would have been habituated, they would have had rich knowledge, they would have been able to predict, because they knew the behavior of the animals, when and where encounters might occur, and thereby assess risk appropriately. In addition to this knowledge, this cultural and social knowledge, also material knowledge, right? Material culture of toolkits to be able to deal with predators, ambush tactics, spears. And by about 30,000 years ago, we know we had a cooperative relationship to the earliest ancestors of domesticated dog, would have been called wolf dog. This was something that was beginning to occur by about 33,000+ years ago, right? A very important part of our history that began to radically change in the Holocene, or the so-called Neolithic Revolution, at about 10, depending on where you are in the old world, between about 8 and 11,000 years ago, when humans started to settle down, domesticate crops, domesticate animal species, put up fences, a changed relationship with wildlife, and a new ethic of predator control, which was then moved from the old world as white Western settlers sort of colonized North America, impacting ethics on the ground by those colonizers by about 400-ish years ago. And then, of course, moving westward inexorably in manifest destiny right at about 200 years ago. And what we know, of course, in this group, we're all aware of the fact that what took thousands of years in Western and, to a lesser degree, Central Europe occurred in about 200 years in the United States. The upshot being that for many generations, humans simply have not had to deal with the exigencies of life with predators. A loss of habituation, knowledge, tools results in naive behavior, an activated limbic system, which impairs decision-making, resulting in reduced tolerance. And we know that even in the absence of the fearful stimulus, even without even ever seeing a wolf or a grizzly bear, the same neural structures are involved in learned fear, right? So this, as I've mentioned, comes through, right, through the fairy tales that colonizers brought over from the old world. Observational, meaning if you see someone that is scared, your mirror neurons are activated in the neurocortex, you become fearful. social learning of fear, something that's been called sloth, right? So this is a socialized, embedded kind of process that results in this perfect storm of antipathy and dread, as it's been called in the psychology literature. Literally, it's operationalized as dread towards predators. And this is something that Joel Berger and I wrote up last year, right? This perfect sort of storm against a backdrop. And again, depending on your perspective, what I consider good news, right, of adaptation and rewilding and protection of endangered species in Europe and the United States, which means more predators, right, in areas where they haven't been. Which brings us right back to where we began, right? And the experience of seeing op-eds, of our magazine articles, of, sort of ad campaigns about, in this case, Proposition 114 and having wolves back. Now, the good news is that we can take this information and do something with it. And it's actually, for those of you in the audience, of which I'm sure there are many who have been doing this as a living, right, for a long time, we know that there are long-tested strategies to life with predators that go back thousands, if not millions, actually, if you go deep about in evolutionary time to Homo erectus and earlier hominin species, strategies that rest on being accustomed to having those predators around, learning, and tools. And so arguably, some of the most important aspects of this is simply becoming accustomed to it, right? And we know that as the stimulus, in this case, grizzly bear coming back, wolves coming back, as these stimuli become more familiar, emotional reaction is downregulated, right? And with this downregulated fear comes, and again, all of these pieces are documented in the scientific literature, comes increased tolerance. Now, most folks don't live in areas where there are grizzly bear coming back or wolves coming back. So the question is, how do you get that exposure? And there are multiple true and tried methods for this. Repeated exposure, and the top image that you're seeing there, a video, and it does need to be repeated exposure. In the image below, there are ways of becoming habituated to a bear charging, right? So repeated exposure that just wraps your head around the fact that, what behaviors on the part of other species look like. Of course, this is done in collaboration with an extremely rich toolkit that we now have that are being developed by numerous people. There's a huge literature. I don't have the time to get into this, and many of you out there are experts on this anyway. I do want to emphasize the significance of dogs. This was beautifully already presented, of course, by my colleague and friend, Christina Gaylor, with the more recent use of dogs. But this is not a new thing, right? We know that the primary reason for humans tolerating wolves, early proto-dog, 30,000 plus years ago, was because of their protection against predators and also their utility in cooperative hunting, right? So I just have this image here to indicate that we have vast sort of continual knowledge of the use of dogs. We've got all these dog breeds. Christina gave nuances to this. Many of these dog breeds do derive from the old world where they didn't go extinct, or if they did become extinct, they've been sort of brought back. They are now highly effective, we know, and it's not just dogs, but other guardian animals as well. And I want to end on that note because I am a dog owner and trainer, and end on the happy image of dogs and how we can engage with them. I want to thank you all for your attendance today, for being here, for being just part of this whole exciting conference. There were so many folks to thank. I want to thank in particular my esteemed colleagues at the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, including Mike Phillips, Rob Edward, Matt Barnes, Courtney Vale, Gary Skiba, my superb PhD students, Rosie Sanchez, who has been part of the campaign to get wolves back into Colorado for many, many years, Emily Goldenbeam, Amanda Elwanger, my colleagues, Christina Gaylor, Amanda Stronza, Stuart Breck, and Joel Berger. And then here's an array of some of my funders over the years, for which I thank. And I will end there with a question for you, which is, are there any questions? And thank you for your time.